At 67, most men measured their days in doctor appointments and early bird specials. Robert Williams measured his in square footage. 23,000 feet of polished hospital corridor every night, mopped twice, buffed once, trash collected from 64 rooms across 3 wings. The math never changed. Neither did the uniform, gray cotton that smelled of industrial detergent no matter how many times it cycled through the wash in his apartment building's basement. He parked the 2003 Ford Taurus in the employee's lot at 9:47, same spot near the loading dock where the overhead light had burned out 3 months ago and maintenance kept forgetting to replace. 13 minutes early. Always 13 minutes. Not 12, not 15. 13 gave him time to change, check his cart, and start the first sweep of the private wing before the night shift nurses finished their handoff reports. The locker room tile was cracked near the third sink, had been since his first week 9 years back. He changed methodically, dress shirt folded into his locker, gray uniform pulled over the white undershirt he wore winter and summer both. His hands fumbled the buttons. Arthritis in the knuckles, the doctor said last year. $10 for the copay, $40 for the prescription he filled once, then switched to over-the-counter when the math stopped working. The mirror showed him what it always did. A face carrying more years than 67 should hold, eyes that tracked everything whether he wanted them to or not. Riverside Memorial's private wing existed in a different atmosphere than the rest of the hospital. The public floors smelled of cafeteria food and fear. The private wing smelled of money trying to cover up the same fear with eucalyptus diffusers and fresh flowers delivered daily. The entrance required a key code he'd memorized 9 years ago, numbers punched into a pad that clicked open with a sound like approval withdrawn the moment you stepped through. Patricia Johnson sat at the reception desk, 45 and surgically enhanced in ways meant to look natural but never quite did. She glanced up when the door clicked, registered the gray uniform, returned to her computer screen. Robert had scrubbed vomit from the carpet 3 feet from her desk on a Tuesday morning 2 years back while she ate yogurt and never looked down once. The corridor stretched 60 feet, recessed lighting that cost more per fixture than his monthly rent. 12 suites, 8 currently occupied according to the status board, he checked from habit. Room 14 had been occupied for 6 weeks. The name next to it read, Anderson, J., Pediatric. No other details visible from the board, but 6 weeks in the private wing meant either money enough to burn or desperation enough to try. His cart waited in the supply closet, exactly where he'd left it 10 hours earlier. Mop bucket, cleaning solutions in bottles color-coded by the manufacturer for people who couldn't read labels, trash bags in 3 sizes, microfiber cloths that actually just pushed dirt around, but administration liked how they photographed for the website. He rolled it into the corridor, wheels squeaking on the 16th rotation of the left rear caster. Maintenance knew about that too. Room 14's door stood half open. Hospital policy for occupied rooms during evening hours, something about patient monitoring and nurse access. Through the gap he could see part of the bed, monitors arranged like a shrine to modern medicine, and a small shape under white blankets that didn't move much. Jessica Anderson, 8 years old according to the chart he wasn't supposed to look at, but had seen anyway during a hallway conversation between nurses who treated him like mobile furniture. 6 weeks of the best medical minds money could hire. The nurses talked about it in fragments he collected while emptying their break room trash. 20 specialists rotating through, tests that required names longer than the results they produced, treatment protocols adjusted so many times the pharmacy complained about expired stock. An 8-year-old girl getting worse while people with diplomas covering entire walls stood around looking concerned and expensive. He started at the far end of the corridor, working backward toward the reception desk. The pattern never varied. Empty the trash first, wipe down surfaces, vacuum where carpet met tile, mop the tile, buff if needed, restock paper products. 2 hours for the private wing if he worked steady, less if they wanted it done fast, more if they wanted it done right. They never specified, so he split the difference and they never complained. The window in room 8 reflected his shape as he passed, an old black man in a gray uniform pushing a cart. Invisible in the way that service workers became invisible, not through any failure of existence, but through a collective decision by everyone else to look past. 9 years of this. Before that, 2 years of unemployment broken by day labor jobs that paid cash and destroyed what was left of his back. Before that, 11 months of legal battles that accomplished nothing except converting savings into attorney fees. Before all of that, 28 years of a different life entirely. The thought arrived unwanted, the way they always did during the quiet stretches. He pushed the cart forward and let muscle memory handle the work while his brain went somewhere else, somewhere it shouldn't go, but couldn't help visiting. Brennan Pharmaceuticals had occupied a glass tower in downtown Chicago with a view of Lake Michigan that looked different every season. His office sat on the 14th floor, corner position, windows on 2 sides. Chief Toxicologist, a title that came with a parking space and business cards thick enough to feel substantial. 28 years building that, starting from a cramped lab in the basement in 1985 with a newly minted PhD and ambition that seemed reasonable at the time. The work mattered, not in an abstract way, not in the sense of corporate mission statements printed on plaques in the lobby. It mattered because pharmaceutical compounds could heal or harm depending on dosage, delivery method, patient variables that took years to map properly. His team ran the tests that caught problems before they reached human trials. They were good at it. He was better. The memory of his office carried details he couldn't shake even when he wanted to. The coffee mug from a 2007 toxicology conference in Boston. The framed photograph of Elizabeth taken on their 20th anniversary trip to Savannah, her smile caught mid-laugh at something he'd said that he couldn't remember anymore. The whiteboard covered in chemical formulas he rewrote daily, thinking through problems while the rest of the building slept. Room 12 needed extra attention. Someone had spilled something that looked like soup but smelled worse near the bathroom. He cleaned it without thinking, the way he cleaned everything now, hands moving through motions they'd performed thousands of times. The work required no mental engagement, which was either its blessing or its curse depending on the night. The problem started with a diabetes medication called Ventara. Brennan had 3 years of development invested, clinical trials in phase 3, FDA approval projected within 18 months. The projections mattered because Brennan's stock price had been climbing on Ventara's promise, and institutional investors didn't like recalculated timelines. Robert had been reviewing the adverse event reports, routine work that his team handled quarterly. The data came in formatted spreadsheets that reduced human suffering to numerical codes, but you learned to read between the cells if you paid attention. He paid attention, always had. Patients in the trial group showed elevated liver enzymes at rates higher than the control group, not dramatically higher, high enough to notice if you were looking. The initial reports flagged it. The follow-up reports didn't mention it at all. Not because the numbers changed, but because someone had decided those particular data points weren't relevant to the primary outcome measures. He'd flagged it internally first. Professional courtesy, giving the company a chance to address what was probably an oversight. The oversight became a pattern when he pulled the raw trial data and compared it to what had been submitted in the quarterly safety reports. Liver toxicity, kidney stress markers, 2 cardiac events that got coded as pre-existing conditions when the patient's medical histories suggested otherwise. Brennan Pharmaceuticals was scrubbing adverse events from its FDA submissions. Not all of them, just enough to keep Ventara's safety profile clean enough to maintain the approval timeline. He documented everything. Spreadsheets cross-referenced against raw data, statistical analyses showing the probability that the omissions were accidental, the probability rounded to 0. Then he made the mistake of thinking documentation mattered more than politics. Room 14's bathroom needed cleaning. He knocked once, habit from some outdated training manual, waited for a response that wouldn't come from an unconscious child, then entered. The bathroom was larger than his kitchen at home, marble countertops and fixtures that probably cost more than his car. He worked quickly, wiping surfaces, checking supplies, avoiding his reflection in the mirror that covered one entire wall. The smell hit him as he bent to clean the toilet. Underneath the antiseptic overlay of hospital-grade cleaner, Underneath the faint lavender from whatever diffuser they had plugged in near the sink, something else. Metallic, with a sweetness that didn't belong. Faint enough that someone not trained to notice chemical traces might miss it. He didn't miss it. Robert straightened slowly, his back protesting. The smell registered in his mind the way a word on the tip of your tongue registers, familiar but not quite accessible. He breathed in again, testing. Definitely there. Definitely wrong for a hospital bathroom where an 8-year-old girl had been declining for 6 weeks, despite every intervention modern medicine could provide. He finished the bathroom and returned to the main room. The girl looked smaller than 8, or maybe illness just compressed people into earlier versions of themselves, pale in a way that went beyond fair skin into something suggesting the blood had other priorities. Monitors beeped in rhythms he'd learned to tune out, vitals displayed on screens arranged for medical staff who understood the numbers. The IV stand held 2 bags, one labeled saline, the other something longer he couldn't read from this angle without being obvious about it. Not that anyone was watching. Margaret Anderson, the girl's mother, hadn't been in the room when he entered, CEO of Anderson Biotech. According to the nurse's gossip, a pharmaceutical company large enough that Robert had heard of it during his previous life. Money couldn't buy health, but it could rent every available option while hope lasted. He emptied the small trash can near the bed. Tissues, a juice box with a bendy straw, the wrapper from some medical supply he didn't recognize. Standard. Nothing that explained the smell still lingering in his sinuses. The smell bothered him through the rest of his shift. He ran through possibilities while working through rooms 10, 8, 6. Hospital-grade disinfectants came in dozens of formulations. Medical equipment used various plastics that off-gassed under heat. Patient medications could produce unusual odors through metabolic byproducts. None of that fit. The smell was specific, chemical, deliberate. He clocked out at 6:14, same time as always, and drove home through streets just starting to fill with morning traffic. His apartment occupied the 2nd floor of a building that had seen better decades, 3 rooms plus a bathroom that stayed functional through prayer and strategic placement of buckets during heavy rain. Emily would be awake soon, her alarm set for 6:30 to get ready for school. The thought of Emily tightened something in his chest. 12 years old, 7th grade, smart enough to understand that her grandfather worked nights cleaning hospitals because the alternative was not working at all. She never complained, never asked why they couldn't afford the school trips her friends took, never mentioned that her shoes came from the discount bin and her winter coat was 2 years past fitting properly. He made coffee from the same grounds he'd used yesterday, the filter still damp but serviceable for one more pot. The kitchen table doubled as his workspace, a scarred surface that wobbled if you leaned on the left side. He sat down with his coffee and pulled out his phone, the screen cracked in the upper right corner from a drop 3 months back he couldn't afford to repair. The smell from room 14's bathroom wouldn't leave him alone. He opened the browser and started searching, typing in chemical descriptors and following links through academic databases he still had access to through some glitch in Brennan's account deactivation process. Metallic, sweet, faint but persistent. Dimethyl sulfoxide, DMSO. Penetration enhancer used in pharmaceutical compounding. Increased absorption rates of active compounds through skin and mucous membranes. He knew the compound, had worked with it extensively during his years formulating transdermal delivery systems. The smell was distinctive if you knew what to smell for. DMSO had legitimate medical uses. It also had uses that weren't listed in any treatment protocol for a pediatric patient with unexplained systemic decline. Emily's door opened down the hall. Footsteps, bathroom sounds, the shower running. Robert closed the browser and finished his coffee. The thought tried to form completely. Why would an 8-year-old's hospital bathroom smell like a penetration enhancer? He pushed it down. Years of being invisible had taught him that thinking too much about things above your pay grade only caused problems. He made breakfast while Emily showered. Scrambled eggs from the carton, toast from the discount bread that went stale fast but cost half as much. She emerged, dressed for school, backpack already loaded, hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look older than 12, or maybe that was just him noticing how fast the years moved. "You okay, Grandpa?" "The eggs smell weird." "Old carton. Still good, though." She ate without further comment, the trust of someone who'd never had reason to doubt. He'd raised her since she was 3, since his son Christopher had decided that heroin offered better company than fatherhood. 9 years of school mornings and homework help and parent-teacher conferences where he was old enough to be mistaken for the great-grandfather. The bus came at 7:15. He walked her to the corner, watched her climb aboard, waved when she turned to look back through the window. Then he returned to the apartment and tried to sleep. The smell followed him into dreams that made no sense, Elizabeth and chemical formulas and a courtroom where the judge had his son's face. He woke at 2 in the afternoon, the room too bright from sun leaking through blinds he kept meaning to replace. His phone showed 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize and 1 text from Emily about a permission slip for a field trip that cost $20 he'd need to figure out how to find. He heated leftover rice in the microwave and ate it standing at the counter. The database on his phone still showed the DMSO search results. He shouldn't care. An 8-year-old girl he'd never spoken to, in a room he cleaned 5 nights a week, suffering from conditions that 20 specialists couldn't diagnose. None of his business. He was the janitor. The floors needed mopping. Except he'd spent 28 years training his mind to see patterns, to recognize when something in the data didn't match the narrative. DMSO in a pediatric hospital room made no sense unless someone was using it to deliver something that needed enhanced absorption. He opened a new browser window and searched for Jessica Anderson's condition. The search returned nothing, which made sense given patient privacy laws. He tried Anderson Biotech instead, found the company website, the stock price charts showing healthy growth, press releases about pipeline drugs in development. Margaret Anderson's biography listed her as founder and CEO, 41 years old, Ph.D. in molecular biology from Stanford, 20 years building a mid-size pharmaceutical company that specialized in metabolic disorder treatments. A woman who would know exactly what DMSO could do in the wrong hands. Robert deleted his search history and closed the browser. Paranoia, probably. Years of unemployment and legal battles had left him seeing conspiracies in coincidence. The smell had a reasonable explanation. Medical facilities used thousands of compounds. His brain was making connections that didn't exist because making connections had been his job for 3 decades, and some habits didn't retire just because you did. He spent the afternoon at the public library, the one luxury he allowed himself besides keeping Emily fed and housed. The building was warm, quiet, filled with people who had nowhere else to be on a Thursday afternoon. He found a corner desk and opened his laptop, the machine 7 years old and slower every month but functional enough for what he needed. The academic databases he accessed through his Phantom Brennan credentials held decades of research on drug delivery mechanisms. He searched for DMSO applications, transdermal absorption enhancement, pediatric dosing considerations. The rabbit hole went deep. Papers, citing papers, citing papers, until he'd accumulated enough information to confirm what he already suspected. DMSO could deliver almost anything through skin or mucous membrane. Paired with the right compound and the right delivery schedule, you could introduce substances that would bypass normal metabolic processing, avoid detection in standard toxicology screens, and produce symptoms that looked like organic disease rather than external poisoning. He sat back in the creaking library chair and stared at his screen. 28 years of expertise said this was possible. 9 years of being invisible said thinking about it would only make his life harder. The library closed at 8. He drove to work, parked in his spot, changed into his uniform. The private wing waited, same as every night, same codes on the same keypad. Patricia Johnson looked through him on her way out, the night receptionist settling in with her coffee and her phone. Room 14's door stood half open. He knocked, waited, entered. Jessica Anderson hadn't moved. The monitors showed numbers he couldn't interpret from across the room, but the pattern looked the same as last night. declining by increments small enough that any single measurement meant nothing, large enough that 6 weeks added up to a child who looked like she was dissolving. He cleaned quickly, efficiently, trying not to notice details that weren't his concern. The IV stand held the same 2 bags. The trash can contained similar contents. The bathroom smelled the same. No, not the same. Stronger. Robert stood in the bathroom doorway and breathed carefully. The DMSO smell was more pronounced tonight, recent enough that it hadn't fully dissipated into the ventilation system. Someone had been in here within the last few hours, using something that required a penetration enhancer. He checked the schedule sheet posted near the nurse's station, the one that listed doctor rounds and specialist consultations. Dr. Donald Thompson, Chief of Pediatrics, had conducted morning assessment at 8:30. The notation read, "Solo eval, PT rest required, solo evaluation, no nurses present, patient requiring rest," which meant no family in the room either. Dr. Thompson alone with Jessica Anderson and her IV lines during a window when no one else was watching. Robert finished his shift on autopilot, muscle memory handling the work, while his mind ran scenarios he shouldn't be running. Thompson had been the lead physician for all 6 weeks. Thompson, who had trained at Johns Hopkins, consulted at Mayo, published 17 papers on pediatric metabolic disorders. Thompson, who wore suits under his white coat that cost more than Robert made in 3 months. Thompson, who had solo access to a declining patient twice a week, every week, while 20 other specialists tried to diagnose a condition that made no medical sense. He drove home at 6:14. Emily was still asleep. He made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened his laptop. The search for Donald Thompson returned exactly what he expected. Impeccable credentials, distinguished career, speaking engagements at conferences around the world. The kind of doctor parents begged to see their children, the kind hospitals featured in their marketing materials. Robert searched deeper, into the parts of the internet where financial disclosure forms lived. Public information, technically, if you knew where to look and had the patience to wade through bureaucratic filing systems that seemed designed to prevent anyone from actually finding anything. Dr. Donald Thompson held a minority stake in Meridian Capital Partners. The investment firm's SEC filings showed short positions on multiple biotech stocks. Anderson Biotech appeared on the list, shorted heavily 3 months ago at prices well above current market value. If Anderson Biotech's stock crashed, Meridian Capital Partners would profit substantially. If Margaret Anderson, CEO and founder, became consumed by a dying child and unable to manage her company, the stock would crash. If the company folded or sold at distressed prices, the short positions would pay out around $140 million. Thompson's minority stake would convert to approximately $11.2 million. Robert closed the laptop and sat in his kitchen while dawn leaked through the windows. The math was clear. The chemistry was clear. The opportunity was clear. What wasn't clear was what he could possibly do about any of it. Last time he'd tried to stop something like this, he'd lost everything. His career, his wife, his son to drugs that maybe wouldn't have looked so appealing if the family hadn't been drowning in debt and shame. He'd reported wrongdoing to the proper authorities, followed every protocol, trusted that evidence mattered more than institutional inertia. The FDA investigation into Brennan Pharmaceuticals had gone nowhere. The company's lawyers had outmaneuvered his lawyers. The wrongful termination suit settled for an amount that covered his legal fees and nothing else. Ventara got approved 18 months later, exactly on schedule. Brennan's stock price climbed. People who knew which data to ignore got promoted. Robert had gotten a gray uniform and a mop. Emily's alarm went off. He heard her moving around, getting ready for school, oblivious to the fact that her grandfather was sitting in the kitchen thinking about whether an 8-year-old stranger's life was worth destroying what little stability they'd managed to build. "Morning, Grandpa. You look tired. Didn't sleep well. Bad dreams?" Something like that. She ate her breakfast, shouldered her backpack, kissed his cheek on her way out the door. The same routine as every morning, the same trust that he'd be there when she got home, that the lights would stay on and the rent would get paid and nothing would upend the fragile normal they'd constructed. He washed the dishes and tried to convince himself that he was wrong about all of it. DMSO had innocent explanations. Financial investments didn't prove criminal intent. A doctor's solo evaluations were standard practice. 20 specialists missing a diagnosis didn't mean the diagnosis was murder. His hands shook while drying the plates. Arthritis, the doctor had said. The same doctor who'd charged $10 for the copay and $40 for the prescription Robert couldn't keep affording. The same medical system that employed people like Thompson, that built private wings for people like Margaret Anderson, that made Robert invisible 9 years ago and expected him to stay that way. He pulled out his phone and opened the photos he'd taken last night. He hadn't consciously decided to take them, but apparently some part of his brain had decided evidence mattered. The IV setup, the medication labels, the timestamp on the monitors. Nothing dramatic, nothing that proved anything, but it was a start. Robert Williams had spent 9 years being invisible, learning to move through spaces where nobody watched because nobody cared. He'd learned patience. He'd learned observation. He'd learned that being underestimated was sometimes an advantage. An 8-year-old girl was dying while her mother paid millions to doctors who couldn't help because one of them was causing the problem. 20 specialists looked at symptoms and missed the pattern because they weren't trained to see deliberate harm disguised as disease. Robert was trained. 28 years of training that didn't disappear just because the nameplate came off his door. He'd lost everything once trying to stop this exact kind of evil. Lost his career, his wife, his dignity. The system had proven it didn't care about being right as much as it cared about being undisturbed. But the system hadn't anticipated that the janitor mopping room 14's floor might be the one person in the building who could recognize pharmaceutical murder when it smelled like DMSO and looked like metabolic collapse. He closed his eyes and saw Emily's face, saw the trust there, the expectation that adults did the right thing even when it cost them. Saw Jessica Anderson's too pale face in a hospital bed, surrounded by people who couldn't help her because they didn't know they needed to look for someone killing her on purpose. Robert opened his laptop and started documenting everything. The timeline of Dr. Thompson's solo assessments, the correlation with Jessica's decline episodes, the DMSO smell appearing on assessment days, the financial motivation linking Meridian Capital to Anderson Biotech's destruction. He typed until his arthritic hands cramped, until he had 17 pages of observations and analyses and chemical theory explaining exactly how someone with pharmaceutical expertise could poison a child slowly enough to avoid detection. Then he saved it all, encrypted it, and tried to figure out who would possibly listen to an old man in a gray uniform claiming to know more than 20 specialists combined. The answer was probably no one. But Emily would ask someday what he'd done when he knew something was wrong, and he needed an answer better than nothing. The scientific supply company occupied a strip mall between a check-cashing place and a vape shop, the kind of location that made Robert wonder how they stayed in business. The answer appeared in the form of 2 college students arguing about centrifuge speeds near the entrance, backpacks loaded with textbooks, the casual assumption that $300 for lab equipment was an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. He waited until they left before entering. The clerk looked about 25, beard trimmed with precision that suggested more attention to appearance than the job warranted. A name tag read, Trevor. Help you find something? Basic chemistry analysis kit. Colorimetric testing. Trevor's eyebrows lifted slightly, the universal expression of retail workers encountering customers outside their expected demographic. School project? Research. The word came out flat enough to discourage follow-up questions. Trevor shrugged and led him down an aisle packed with glassware and reagents. The kit he recommended cost $340, which was $60 more than Robert had planned to spend and $240 more than Emily's birthday fund currently held. He paid in cash, bills that had been sitting in an envelope marked Emergency taped under the kitchen sink. Trevor bagged the purchase without comment, probably already forgotten by the time Robert reached his car. The apartment felt smaller with the chemistry kit sitting on the kitchen table. Equipment designed for student labs, Nothing sophisticated, but sufficient for what he needed. Emily wouldn't be home for 3 more hours. He had time. The IV connector swab from last night waited in a Ziploc bag he'd triple-sealed and stored in the refrigerator behind condiments too old to still be safe. He'd collected it at 2:30 a.m., the gap between nursing shift checks when room 14 sat empty except for Jessica's unconscious form and the monitors tracking her decline. His hands shook setting up the glassware. Age or nerves or both. The tremor made pouring reagents difficult, but muscle memory from 3 decades of laboratory work steadied him enough. The procedure was simple in theory. Dissolve the sample, add the colorimetric reagent, observe the color change that would indicate presence or absence of the compound class he suspected. In practice, everything about this was insane. A 67-year-old janitor running toxicology tests on his kitchen table with equipment meant for high school students, trying to prove that a renowned pediatrician was committing murder for financial gain. The kind of thing that sounded reasonable at 3 a.m. when you couldn't sleep and looked absurd in afternoon light streaming through windows that needed cleaning. The sample dissolved in solution. He added 3 drops of the first reagent, watched the liquid turn faintly pink. Normal, expected. The second reagent went in, 5 drops measured carefully despite his shaking hands. The solution shifted to amber within 30 seconds. Robert sat down hard in the chair that wobbled on the left side. Amber meant positive for glucocorticoid compounds. The specific shade, cross-referenced against the color chart included in the kit, suggested a synthetic variant rather than naturally occurring cortisol. He ran the test again with a fresh sample to confirm. Same result. Amber. Distinctive. Unmistakable to anyone who'd spent years analyzing pharmaceutical formulations. Someone was introducing synthetic glucocorticoids into Jessica Anderson's system. The compound class included legitimate medications, anti-inflammatory drugs prescribed for dozens of conditions. It also included modified variants designed for specific delivery mechanisms, compounds that could be engineered to produce hepatotoxic metabolites that wouldn't appear on standard pediatric toxicology screens. The kind of compound that required pharmaceutical expertise to formulate. The kind that would cause exactly the constellation of symptoms Jessica displayed if dosed carefully over weeks. Liver stress, kidney dysfunction, neurological decline that mimicked metabolic disease rather than external poisoning. Robert photographed the test results, the color comparison chart, the timestamp on his phone showing today's date. Then he cleaned everything meticulously, disassembling the glassware and storing it in the box the kit came in. Emily would be home soon. She couldn't see this, couldn't know that her grandfather was pursuing something that would either prove he was right or prove he was losing his mind. She arrived at 3:45, backpack heavy with textbooks and the particular energy of 12-year-olds who'd spent 7 hours being told to sit still. How was school? Fine. We're doing the Civil War in history. Mr. Patterson says we have to pick a topic for a research paper. What are you thinking? She dumped her backpack on the couch and headed for the refrigerator, emerging with an apple that had seen better days. Maybe something about the medicine stuff, like how they did surgery back then without the things we have now. Robert's chest tightened watching her bite into the apple, casual and trusting and completely unaware that her grandfather was documenting evidence of a crime that could destroy the small stability they'd built. That's a good topic. You'll need library time for research. Can you take me Saturday? He nodded, already calculating whether he could afford to miss a shift. Probably not. Definitely not if this situation with Jessica Anderson went anywhere beyond his kitchen table and his increasingly elaborate paranoia. Emily finished her apple and started on homework at the same table where he'd just confirmed that a child was being systematically poisoned. The juxtaposition felt obscene. He made dinner from ingredients that barely qualified as a meal, watched her eat while reviewing algebra problems, and tried to figure out his next move. The documentation was clear. The chemistry was clear. The financial motive was clear. What wasn't clear was who would believe him. He'd tried reporting pharmaceutical misconduct before. The FDA had forms, procedures, channels designed to protect whistleblowers and investigate claims. Those channels worked beautifully if you had institutional backing, legal resources, and evidence from inside the system. They worked less well if you were a janitor with a criminal chemistry kit and accusations against a doctor whose credentials could wallpaper a hospital wing. But there was one person who'd listened before, even if nothing had come of it. After Emily went to bed, Robert pulled up his old email account, the one he'd maintained from his Brennan days, the address that still received spam from pharmaceutical conferences and journal subscriptions he couldn't afford to renew. He scrolled back 3 years to a folder marked FBI. Agent Kenneth Walker had been assigned to the Brennan Pharmaceuticals investigation in 2013. Young then, probably 40 now, black like Robert, which had seemed significant at the time, though it hadn't changed the outcome. Walker had interviewed him twice, reviewed all the documentation, expressed what seemed like genuine outrage at what Brennan had done. Then the investigation had stalled in bureaucratic channels, and Walker had called to explain with what sounded like real regret that the case didn't meet evidentiary thresholds for prosecution. Corporate wrongdoing was hard to prove when the corporation had lawyers who knew exactly how much truth they could obscure without technically lying. Robert opened a new email. The cursor blinked in the empty message field, waiting for words that would either save a child's life or confirm that he'd learned nothing from losing everything the first time. He typed, subject line, Brennan case redux, pediatric poisoning, time critical. The message itself took an hour to compose. Facts only, no speculation, the timeline laid out with the precision of someone who'd written hundreds of research reports. Dr. Thompson's solo assessments correlated with Jessica Anderson's decline. DMSO presence in room. Positive glucocorticoid test from IV connector sample. Financial motive through Meridian Capital Partners, shorting Anderson Biotech stock. He attached the documentation, the photographs, the chemical analysis results. Then he sat staring at the send button while doubt performed its familiar erosion work. This could go nowhere. Probably would go nowhere. Walker might not even remember him, might delete the email as the ramblings of someone who'd gone from respected scientist to conspiracy theorist in a gray uniform. Or worse, Walker might take it seriously and the investigation might expose Robert's methods, the illegal sample collection, the unauthorized testing, the violation of patient privacy laws that would get him fired and possibly arrested. Emily's door was cracked open the way she liked it, nightlight casting enough glow that darkness didn't feel absolute. She trusted him to keep them safe, to make decisions that protected rather than destroyed. He clicked send. The response came at 2:14 a.m. while he lay awake staring at ceiling stains that resembled maps of places he'd never visit. His phone vibrated, screen bright in the darkness. Walker's reply contained 3 words. Can you meet? They arranged it for Thursday afternoon at a coffee shop downtown, the kind of place where people conducted business that required neutral territory. Robert burned a sick day he couldn't afford, told Emily he had a doctor's appointment, and arrived 15 minutes early from habit. Walker looked older, but not old, the kind of 40 that came from stress rather than years. He wore a suit that suggested government salary, competent but not expensive, and carried a folder that looked substantial enough to contain actual investigation rather than polite dismissal. Dr. Williams. The title landed strange after 9 years of being called by his first name, or not called at all. Mr. Williams is fine. Lost the doctor part a while back. Walker slid into the booth across from him, set the folder on the table between them like evidence at trial. I remember your case. Brennan Pharmaceuticals, Ventara drug trial, data manipulation. Still think about it sometimes, the ones that got away. Got away implies they were ever in reach. Fair point. Your email got my attention. Pediatric poisoning is a strong accusation. Robert walked him through it again, this time with the precision of someone defending a dissertation. The chemical evidence, the timeline correlation, the financial motive linking Thompson to Anderson Biotech's destruction. Walker listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small notebook that looked well used. The sample collection was illegal. You know that. I know a lot of things, including that an 8-year-old girl is dying while 20 doctors stand around looking confused because one of them is causing the problem. Walker flipped through his notes, the gesture buying time to formulate whatever came next. Here's where we are. Your evidence is compelling but inadmissible. Nothing you collected would survive a defense attorney's first objection. We need legitimate access to run official tests, which requires probable cause, which requires credible witness testimony. I'm not credible. I'm the janitor who went crazy and started playing chemist. You're a PhD toxicologist with 28 years of pharmaceutical research experience who happens to currently work environmental services. Frame it right, you're exactly credible. Robert watched condensation form on his water glass, the slow transformation of air into liquid given enough time and temperature differential. Frame it how? Walker leaned forward, voice dropping to the register of someone proposing something they shouldn't. You approach the mother directly. Show her what you've shown me. She has legal standing to demand testing, to question treatment protocols, to make noise that forces official response. But she needs to know what questions to ask. And if she thinks I'm insane, then we're no worse off than we are now. But if she listens, if she believes you enough to push back on Thompson, we might get the opening we need for a legitimate investigation. The coffee shop noise filled the silence between them. Espresso machines hissing, conversations blurring into background static, the ordinary sounds of people whose lives didn't include decisions about whether to accuse renowned physicians of murder. Last time I went public with something like this, I lost everything. Walker closed his notebook with a finality that suggested the meeting was ending whether Robert was ready or not. And if you don't go public with this, a child dies, and the man who killed her walks away $11 million richer. Your call, Dr. Williams. Robert drove home through traffic that moved like his thoughts, stop and start, and never quite reaching destination. Emily would be at school for another 2 hours. He had time to think, which was the problem. Too much time just led to finding more reasons why every option was terrible. Approaching Margaret Anderson directly violated every institutional hierarchy that hospitals ran on. Janitors didn't confront CEOs with accusations about their children's doctors. The social distance between a gray uniform and a woman who ran a pharmaceutical company was measured in miles, not feet. But Walker was right about legal standing. Margaret Anderson could demand things that Robert couldn't. She could insist on independent testing, fire Thompson, bring in new specialists without needing to justify her decisions to anyone, if she believed him. That night he wrote a note at the kitchen table while Emily did homework 3 feet away. Math problems she struggled through with the determination of someone who'd inherited stubbornness from both sides of a fractured family tree. The note went through 6 drafts before he settled on something that balanced information with brevity. Mrs. Anderson, your daughter is being poisoned. Dr. Thompson has financial motive. I have proof. I am not crazy. I am invisible. Dr. Robert Williams, Ph.D., toxicology, Brennan Pharmaceuticals retired, current environmental services. He wrote it on paper from Emily's notebook, the only clean sheets available. Blue lines and 3-hole punches that made it look like a middle school assignment rather than an accusation of attempted murder. But that was fitting somehow. Nothing about this situation carried the weight institutional channels would require. The note went into his jacket pocket. He'd deliver it tomorrow, slide it under the door of Margaret Anderson's private waiting room before she arrived for her daily 7:45 visit. Then he'd go back to mopping floors and wait to see whether belief or disbelief destroyed what was left of his life. Thursday night, the private wing held a different quality of silence. 3 of the 12 rooms had been discharged, the turnover rate suggesting successful treatment or abandoned hope. Room 14 remained occupied, Jessica Anderson in her 7th week of decline that baffled everyone who hadn't tested her IV connector for synthetic glucocorticoids. Robert worked his way down the corridor with unusual slowness. The waiting room where Margaret Anderson spent her days sat adjacent to the main hallway, door marked private in letters that suggested you needed permission even to know it existed. The gap under the door was maybe half an inch, Enough for a folded note if you didn't care about the optics of a janitor shoving paper into a CEO's private space. He paused outside, listening for occupation. Nothing. The room should be empty at 11 p.m., Margaret long gone to whatever home she maintained when not watching her daughter dissolve by degrees. He pulled the note from his pocket, unfolded it once to check the message hadn't smudged, refolded it. His hand shook, sliding it under the door. Arthritis, or fear, or the certain knowledge that this action crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The paper disappeared into darkness on the other side, gone from his possession, but not his responsibility. He finished his shift mechanically, muscle memory handling work while his brain spiraled through scenarios. Margaret finds the note and calls security. Margaret finds the note and calls her lawyer. Margaret finds the note and throws it away because janitors don't get to have relevant opinions about medical care. Or Margaret finds the note and reads it, and something in the specificity of the accusations makes her pause long enough to consider that maybe the person mopping her daughter's floor knows something the specialists missed. Dawn arrived the way it always did, indifferent to human drama. Robert drove home, slept poorly, woke to Emily asking about the field trip permission slip he still hadn't figured out how to pay for. $20 might as well be $200 when you were already pulling emergency cash for chemistry kits and missing work for FBI meetings. "I'll take care of it, sweetheart." She smiled, trusting, and headed off to catch her bus. Robert sat at the kitchen table with coffee gone cold and wondered what taking care of it actually meant when your bank account had $215 and the rent was due in 6 days. The library opened at 10. He spent the morning there, laptop struggling through searches about Meridian Capital Partners and their investment strategies. The firm specialized in distressed biotech assets, buying low when companies stumbled and selling high once restructuring improved valuations. The short positions on Anderson Biotech represented a different approach, betting on collapse rather than recovery. Thompson's stake was public record, buried in SEC filings that required patience to locate. 11.6% of Meridian's biotech fund, which translated to substantial profit if Anderson Biotech's stock crashed. The timing lined up. Thompson had invested 3 months ago, right before Jessica Anderson's mysterious illness began. Murder for money wasn't creative, it was just rare enough in pediatric medicine that nobody thought to look for it. Robert printed the financial disclosures on the library's printer, 30 cents per page, another $6 he didn't have but spent anyway. Evidence meant nothing if it existed only on his cracked phone screen. That evening he approached Linda Martinez during her break, catching her in the staff kitchenette where night shift nurses congregated for coffee that could strip paint. "Ms. Martinez, can I ask you something?" She looked up from her phone, expression friendly in the way of people who hadn't yet learned to see through service workers. "Sure, Mr. Williams. What's up?" He'd rehearsed this, kept it simple, planted a seed without making accusations she'd have to report. "Room 14. Have you noticed any pattern with Dr. Thompson's solo assessments?" "Pattern how?" "Timing. When he evaluates Jessica alone versus when the decline episodes happen." Linda's expression shifted, friendliness cooling to professional distance. "Mr. Williams, I appreciate your concern, but patient care discussions need to stay within the medical team. I understand. Just, if you ever wanted to write down the times, just for yourself, you might see something worth noting." He left before she could respond, before the conversation became something she'd have to officially report. But he'd seen the flicker in her expression, the moment where his words landed close enough to her own observations that dismissal wasn't quite automatic. Planting doubt was something. Not much, but something. Friday arrived with no response to his note. Margaret Anderson came and went on her usual schedule, no security team dragging Robert from the building, no summons to explain himself to hospital administration. Maybe she'd never found it. Maybe she had and decided it was exactly the kind of crazy you'd expect from someone whose life went wrong enough to end up mopping floors at 67. He collected his paycheck, direct deposit that hit his account at midnight, $460 minus taxes, and the health insurance he couldn't afford not to carry. Rent was $600. Emily's school expenses ran another 100 minimum. Food, utilities, the car insurance that kept his license valid for the 30-minute commute. The math didn't work. Never had. He made it work anyway through strategies that involved eating less and ignoring maintenance issues until they became emergencies. Saturday meant library time with Emily. She'd brought her Civil War research project, books stacked on the table between them while she took notes in handwriting that looked like his did 30 years ago. "Grandpa, did you know they used chloroform for surgery? Just put people to sleep with chemicals. Modern anesthesia is more complicated, but yes, same basic principle." She kept reading, occasionally asking questions that reminded him she'd inherited more than stubbornness. The curiosity was there, the need to understand how things worked rather than just accepting surface explanations. In a different life, with different circumstances, she'd go to college and become exactly the kind of person who made discoveries that mattered. In this life, she'd probably end up fighting for scholarships while working night shifts to stay afloat. The thought made his chest tight. They stayed until closing, Emily gathering her materials with the satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished something. Robert's laptop had spent the afternoon running searches on Margaret Anderson, building a profile of the woman he was asking to believe him. CEO at 41, founded Anderson Biotech at 28 with venture capital and patents from her doctoral research. The company focused on metabolic disorder treatments, which meant she understood pharmacology, understood drug mechanisms, understood enough to recognize legitimate science versus paranoid accusations. She also understood losing things. Her husband had died 4 years ago, car accident on Interstate 90 during a business trip. Single mother since then, raising Jessica alone while running a company. The kind of person who'd learned that control was illusion but maintained it anyway because the alternative was chaos. Monday morning arrived with ice on the windshield and Emily complaining about the cold in ways that suggested her coat really had stopped fitting. Robert drove her to school, watching her run toward the building in a jacket that exposed 3 inches of wrist, and felt the particular helplessness of knowing the problem and lacking the solution. His phone rang during the drive back. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, had learned that unknown numbers meant debt collectors or scams, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Williams? This is Margaret Anderson." His hands tightened on the steering wheel hard enough that old injuries in his knuckles protested. "Yes, ma'am, I found your note. I need to speak with you. Are you available this morning?" The question carried the assumption that of course he was available, that people in gray uniforms had schedules that bent to accommodate people who ran pharmaceutical companies. She wasn't wrong. "I can meet wherever you'd like. The coffee shop downtown, the one on 5th Street, 8:30. He arrived at 8:15, same booth where he'd met Walker, same nervous energy that made sitting still feel impossible. Margaret Anderson walked in at 8:28, 2 minutes early, which said something about her relationship with time. She looked like her pictures, sharp features and silver threading through dark hair, but the photographs hadn't captured the exhaustion carved into her expression. 7 weeks of watching your child die would do that. She sat down across from him without preamble, set a folder on the table that looked similar to Walker's. Everyone important seemed to carry folders. Talk. The word wasn't a request. Robert talked. He laid out the timeline, the chemical evidence, the financial motive, everything he'd documented in his kitchen while Emily did homework. Margaret listened without interrupting, her focus absolute in the way of people trained to process complex information quickly. When he finished, she opened her folder. Inside were printouts that matched his own research, financial disclosures she'd apparently pulled independently, medical records that he shouldn't see but she clearly had access to. How long? He'd anticipated the question, had run the symptom progression backward based on the pattern of decline. 7 to 8 weeks, since around the time Thompson made his investment in Meridian Capital. Her jaw tightened, the only external sign of whatever was happening internally. She closed the folder with controlled precision. "You're telling me that Dr. Thompson, the physician I've paid over $600,000 to save my daughter, has been slowly killing her to profit from destroying my company?" "I'm telling you the evidence suggests that, yes." "Why should I believe you?" The question was fair. Robert met her eyes, seeing the calculation there. The CEO evaluating risk versus reward in a scenario where the stakes were her child's life. Because 9 years ago I lost my career, my wife, and my son trying to stop exactly this kind of thing. I have nothing left to lose and no reason to lie. And because deep down, you already know something is wrong. 20 specialists, 7 weeks, $500,000 in tests, and nobody can tell you what's killing your daughter. That doesn't happen with organic disease. That happens when someone is making sure you don't find answers. Margaret Anderson studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching until it felt like a third presence at the table. What do you need from me? Legal standing. Demand independent testing. Fire Thompson. Bring in specialists who aren't looking at metabolic disorders because they've been told that's the problem. Test for synthetic glucocorticoids with hepatotoxic metabolites. You'll find them. And if we find them, what happens? Thompson gets arrested. Your daughter recovers once the poisoning stops. Meridian Capital loses their short position. You get to keep your company and your child. He didn't mention what happened to him in that scenario. Margaret didn't ask. She pulled out her phone, dialed without checking the number, clearly someone on speed dial. Daniel, I need our corporate attorney and the private security team at Riverside Memorial in 1 hour. Full sweep capability. No, I'll explain when you get there. She hung up, returned her attention to Robert. You're coming with me. If this is real, I want you there when we expose it. If it's not, I want you there to explain why you destroyed whatever trust I had left in medical institutions. The drive to Riverside Memorial felt longer than the actual 15 minutes. Margaret's car was a black Mercedes that probably cost more than Robert would earn in 5 years, leather interior and dashboard displays that looked like spacecraft controls. She drove in silence, phone buzzing repeatedly with messages she ignored. The hospital parking lot at 9:30 on a Monday held the usual mix of visitors and staff. Margaret pulled into a spot marked Reserved, Administration, another small signal of the different world she inhabited. They walked through the main entrance together, an odd pairing that drew looks from the receptionist. Margaret in her tailored suit that whispered expensive, Robert in the only button-down shirt he owned that didn't have visible repairs. She moved with the certainty of someone who owned every space she entered. He followed, trying to look like he belonged anywhere near her orbit. The conference room she led him to was on the administrative floor, windows overlooking the parking lot, a table that could seat 20 but currently held only the 2 of them. Her attorney arrived first, a man in his 50s with the professional skepticism of someone paid to find problems. The security team came next, 3 people in suits that concealed whatever they were carrying but didn't hide what they were. Margaret made introductions without explaining Robert's presence, then laid out the situation with the same directness she'd used in the coffee shop. Thompson. Poisoning. Financial motive. Evidence that was compelling but inadmissible without official channels. The attorney asked the questions Robert expected. Chain of custody issues. Illegal evidence collection, civil liability, criminal exposure. All the reasons why this was complicated in ways that simple right and wrong didn't address. Margaret cut through it with words that hit like hammers. My daughter is dying. If there's even a 10% chance this man is correct, we pursue it. Legal complications can be managed. Dead children cannot. The room went quiet. The attorney nodded, already shifting to solution mode. We need the FBI involved before any direct action. Private investigation creates legal issues that could undermine prosecution. Robert spoke for the first time since entering the room. Agent Kenneth Walker, FBI field office downtown. He's already briefed on the situation. Margaret's eyes flicked to him, something that might have been approval or might have been calculation. Get him here, now. Walker arrived within 40 minutes, which suggested he'd been expecting the call. He brought 2 colleagues, both carrying folders that made Robert wonder if FBI training included a course on folder-based intimidation. The meeting shifted into procedural territory that Robert only partially followed. Warrants, surveillance authorization, coordinated timing to catch Thompson in the act rather than just proving past crimes. the machinery of official investigation grinding forward now that someone with Margaret Anderson's resources and legal standing had activated it. Dr. Thompson's schedule showed a solo assessment of Jessica Anderson scheduled for Wednesday morning, 9 a.m., 2 days away. Enough time to set up surveillance, position agents, arrange for independent medical testing the moment Thompson left the room. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Let Thompson proceed as normal, document everything, then confront him with evidence that couldn't be explained away. The FBI would seize the IV supplements for testing. Margaret would fire him on the spot. Criminal charges would follow once the lab results confirmed what Robert's kitchen chemistry already knew. "You'll need to be there." Walker's words took a moment to register. Robert looked up from the table where he'd been studying the grain patterns in the wood. "Where?" "Wednesday morning, when we move on Thompson. Your testimony will matter both for the criminal case and the medical review board. We need you present and ready to explain the chemistry." Robert thought about Emily's field trip permission slip, still unsigned, on the kitchen table. Thought about the shift he'd need to miss, the money he couldn't afford not to earn. "I'll be here." The meeting broke up with the efficiency of people who'd done this before, everyone assigned roles and responsibilities and communication protocols. Robert found himself standing in the hallway watching them leave, wondering if this was what vindication felt like or just the calm before everything collapsed again. Margaret Anderson stopped before leaving, turned to face him with an expression that was harder to read than the chemical analysis had been. "Why did you do this? You could have kept your head down, kept your job, stayed invisible, because staying invisible while a child dies makes you complicit. And I've lost enough already. Wasn't going to lose the ability to look my granddaughter in the eye." She nodded once, sharp and definitive, then left without another word. Robert drove home through midday traffic, his phone showing 3 missed calls from the hospital administration office. They'd know by now that he'd been in meetings he had no business attending, that the janitor had crossed lines that were supposed to stay fixed. The calls could wait. Emily would be home in 2 hours. He needed to figure out how to explain that Wednesday morning he'd be helping the FBI arrest a doctor instead of mopping the floors that kept them fed. Or maybe he didn't explain it. Maybe he just went and dealt with the consequences after, the way he'd been dealing with consequences for 9 years. His apartment looked smaller every time he returned, the walls seeming to compress further each month. Emily's homework from last night was still on the table, math problems she'd struggled through with determination that reminded him of her grandmother. Elizabeth had been gone 10 years, cancer eating through her while Robert fought legal battles and burned through savings trying to prove that pharmaceutical companies shouldn't get to hide the truth. She'd died angry at him for choosing principle over pragmatism, for not settling quietly and keeping the insurance that might have saved her. He'd never been sure if she was right. Still wasn't. Wednesday would answer some of that. Either he was right and a child would be saved, and maybe finally doing the right thing would result in something besides destruction, or he was wrong, and Emily would be looking for a new place to live while her grandfather figured out how to survive unemployment at 67 with a criminal record for illegal evidence collection. Robert made dinner from whatever was in the refrigerator, which wasn't much. Emily came home full of energy about the research project, explaining in detail about Civil War medicine and anesthesia and how amazing it was that people survived surgery at all back then. He listened and nodded and tried not to think about how modern medicine could be used to kill just as easily as it could heal when someone with the right expertise decided profit mattered more than life. That night he couldn't sleep. Lay in bed staring at the ceiling while scenarios played through his mind, each one ending differently. None of them certain. At 3 a.m. he gave up and went to the kitchen table, pulled out his laptop, started documenting everything one more time. If Wednesday went wrong, someone needed to know what he'd found. Walker would have the FBI files, but those could disappear into bureaucracy. Emily needed to know that her grandfather had tried, that when he saw something wrong he'd acted even knowing the cost. He wrote until dawn, until his arthritic hands cramped and the words blurred together. Then he saved it all, encrypted it, and sent a copy to Walker with instructions to deliver it to Emily if anything happened. The sun rose on Tuesday with the indifference of a universe that didn't care about human morality. Robert made breakfast, got Emily off to school, and spent the day preparing for what might be his last chance to prove that being invisible for 9 years had taught him exactly how to see what everyone else missed. Wednesday morning arrived cold enough that the Taurus needed 3 attempts before the engine turned over. Robert sat in the parking lot letting it warm up, watching his breath fog the windshield while his phone showed 6:42. Emily was still asleep. He'd left a note on the kitchen table saying he had a work thing, would be home by dinner. Love you. The note didn't mention FBI stings or confronting murderers, or the possibility that by tonight their already fragile life might be completely dismantled. Some details weren't meant for 12-year-olds. Riverside Memorial looked different in early morning light, the building less imposing without darkness to hide its institutional edges. Walker's car was already in the lot, along with 2 unmarked sedans that screamed federal agent to anyone who knew what to look for. Robert parked 3 rows away, gathered the folder containing his documentation, and walked toward an entrance he'd only ever used during night shifts. The conference room from Monday had been converted into a command center. Laptops, communication equipment, a monitoring station showing camera feeds from angles that definitely hadn't been there before. Walker stood near the window reviewing something on a tablet, his colleagues positioned around the room with the purposeful stillness of people waiting for action. "Dr. Williams, glad you made it." Robert nodded, throat too tight for immediate response. The reality of what they were attempting hit different in daylight, surrounded by federal agents and surveillance equipment. This wasn't kitchen table chemistry anymore. This was career-ending, life-destroying territory if anything went wrong. Margaret Anderson entered at 7:53, dressed for battle in a black suit that probably cost more than Robert's car was worth. She acknowledged him with a brief nod, then turned her full attention to Walker. "Status? We've got visual on Thompson's office, the corridor outside room 14, and inside the room itself. Audio is live. The moment he dismisses the nursing staff, we'll have everything documented. And if he doesn't do anything incriminating?" Walker's expression suggested he'd considered this scenario extensively. "Then we have nothing actionable. But based on Dr. Williams's timeline, Thompson has maintained this pattern for 7 weeks. No reason to think he'll deviate today." Margaret's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Robert understood the gamble they were taking. If Thompson suspected anything, if someone had tipped him off, if he simply decided to skip today's solo assessment, then all they had was Robert's kitchen chemistry and accusations that would get laughed out of any legitimate proceeding. The monitoring station showed room 14 from 3 angles. Jessica lay in the bed, motionless except for shallow breathing that made the blanket rise and fall in barely perceptible increments. 7 weeks of systematic poisoning had reduced her to something that looked more like a photograph of a child than an actual living person. Linda Martinez appeared on one of the screens, entering the room for morning vitals check. She moved efficiently, recording numbers from monitors, adjusting the IV flow rate, making notes on a tablet. Her face showed nothing unusual, no indication she'd given any thought to Robert's suggestion about tracking Thompson's solo assessment times. The clock on the wall showed 8:37. Thompson's schedule had him arriving at the hospital by 8:45, making rounds on other patients before the 9 a.m. assessment of Jessica. 23 minutes until they'd know whether Robert was right or whether he'd destroyed what remained of his life for nothing. Margaret stood near the monitors, arms crossed, attention fixed on her daughter's image with an intensity that made Robert's chest hurt. 7 weeks of paying specialists $600,000, while the person supposed to be helping slowly murdered her child. The betrayal was comprehensive, the kind that would reshape how she saw the world. Walker's phone buzzed. He checked it, nodded to the team. "Thompson just entered the building. South entrance. He's heading toward the elevators." The room's energy shifted, everyone moving fractionally closer to their positions. Robert stayed near the back wall, out of the way, watching screens show a scenario he'd mapped out in his kitchen, but never quite believed would reach this point. Thompson appeared on the corridor camera at 8:54. White coat over what was probably another $1,000 suit, tablet under one arm. He looked like every other competent physician making morning rounds, nothing in his bearing suggesting he was walking into federal surveillance. He entered room 7 first, spent 6 minutes there according to the timestamp. Room 9 next, 4 minutes. The pattern continued down the corridor, each stop brief and professional. Linda Martinez accompanied him to each room, her presence the normal protocol for physician assessments. 9:03. Thompson and Linda reached room 14. Robert could see Jessica on the monitors, could see Thompson reviewing her chart, Linda checking the IV connections. Standard procedure. Nothing actionable. Then Thompson's voice came through the audio feed, clear despite the monitoring equipment being hidden in smoke detectors and electrical outlets. Linda, I need to conduct a neurological assessment. The stimuli can be disruptive. Would you mind giving us privacy for about 5 minutes? Linda hesitated. Robert could see it in her body language, the slight pause before responding. Are you sure? I can stay quiet. Thompson's smile was visible on camera, warm and professional and completely false if you knew what to look for. I appreciate that, but I've found these assessments work better without additional observers. Just 5 minutes. Linda left. The door closed behind her. Thompson was alone with Jessica Anderson and the IV line that had been delivering poison for 7 weeks. Walker leaned toward the monitoring station. Record everything. Every movement, every touch. Thompson moved to the IV stand, reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small vial. The camera angle caught it clearly. Glass container maybe 2 inches tall, liquid inside that looked clear under the room's lighting. He uncapped it with practiced efficiency, drew the contents into a syringe he'd also pulled from his pocket. Margaret made a sound, something between a gasp and a growl. Walker put a hand up, signaling everyone to hold position. Not yet. They needed him to actually inject it, needed the action documented beyond any possible defense. Thompson checked the IV line, located the injection port, positioned the syringe. His movements carried the confidence of someone who'd done this many times, muscle memory making it routine. The syringe entered the port. Thompson's thumb pressed the plunger. Clear liquid disappeared into the IV line, mixing with saline, flowing toward Jessica's unconscious form. Now. Walker's word triggered immediate movement. The team flooded out of the conference room, Robert following because no one had told him to stay. The corridor to the private wing felt longer than it ever had during his night shifts, his legs struggling to keep pace with agents who moved with tactical precision. They reached room 14 as Thompson was capping the empty syringe, preparing to pocket it. The door crashed open, Walker entering first with his badge held high. FBI, step away from the patient. Thompson's face did something Robert would remember forever, a micro-expression that cycled through surprise, fear, calculation, and then settled into something resembling indignation. The performance was remarkable, the instantaneous shift from guilt to outrage. What is the meaning of this? I'm conducting a medical assessment. Walker moved to the IV stand, photographed the setup with his phone, then turned to Thompson. You're Dr. Donald Thompson? You know exactly who I am. This is outrageous. I'm calling hospital security. Go ahead. They're already on their way, along with hospital administration and Mrs. Anderson's legal team. In the meantime, I need you to hand over the syringe in your pocket. Thompson's hand moved toward his coat, then froze as he realized what surrendering the evidence would mean. I don't know what you think you saw, but this is a standard vitamin supplement. Perfectly within protocol. Margaret Anderson entered the room, her presence shifting the dynamic entirely. She looked at Thompson with an expression that made Robert grateful he wasn't the target. Vitamin supplement. That's what you're going with, Mrs. Anderson? I understand you're upset about Jessica's condition, but these accusations are baseless. I've been trying to save your daughter's life. You've been ending it. For $11.2 million. Thompson's face lost color, the performance cracking enough to show what lived underneath. He looked at Robert, standing near the doorway, and recognition finally dawned. You, the janitor, you did this. Robert stepped forward, feeling 9 years of invisibility fall away like a uniform he could finally remove. Chief toxicologist, actually. Brennan Pharmaceuticals, 28 years. You'd have known that if you'd looked past the mop. Walker moved between them, hand extended toward Thompson. The syringe. Now. Or we add obstruction to the attempted murder charge. Thompson's hand shook, pulling the syringe from his pocket. He held it out, the glass catching light, evidence that couldn't be explained away. Walker bagged it with the precision of someone who'd done this enough times to make it automatic. 2 more agents entered, along with hospital security and a woman Robert recognized as the hospital's chief administrator. She looked at the scene with an expression suggesting this was approximately her worst nightmare made manifest. Walker addressed her directly. "We need this IV line seized as evidence. The contents will need to be tested by an independent lab. Mrs. Anderson has already arranged for a new medical team to take over her daughter's care immediately." The administrator nodded, already pulling out her phone to make calls that would set bureaucratic machinery in motion. Thompson stood in the center of the room looking smaller than he had 5 minutes ago, the authority that came with credentials and position evaporating in the presence of actual consequences. "Dr. Thompson, you're being detained for questioning regarding the suspected poisoning of Jessica Anderson. You have the right to remain silent." Walker continued through the Miranda warning while another agent photographed everything: the vial, the syringe, the IV setup, the monitoring equipment that had captured Thompson's injection on video that would play in courtrooms and probably news broadcasts. Robert moved to the side, letting the professionals handle the arrest. His role was finished. He'd been right about the chemistry, right about the pattern, right about the financial motive. Being right felt less satisfying than he'd expected, probably because vindication had come 9 years too late to save Elizabeth or his career or his son from the spiral that ended with abandoning Emily. Margaret approached while agents escorted Thompson from the room, his hands now secured behind his back with restraints that looked nothing like the gentle authority he'd wielded for 7 weeks. How long before the poison clears her system? Robert considered the compound class, the half-life of synthetic glucocorticoids, the metabolic processing times for an 8-year-old who'd been systematically weakened, 48 to 72 hours for initial improvement. Full recovery depends on organ damage, but children heal faster than adults. If the new medical team knows what they're treating instead of guessing, she should be okay. Should be. Margaret repeated the words like they were a foreign language she was learning to speak. Should be is better than what we had 5 minutes ago. The new medical team arrived within the hour. Specialists Margaret had apparently contacted the moment Walker confirmed surveillance was in place. They descended on Jessica with the focused intensity of people who finally had actual information to work with instead of symptoms that made no medical sense. Robert watched from the doorway as they disconnected the poisoned IV, started fresh lines with clean fluids, began running tests that would baseline her current condition for comparison against the recovery they expected. The room transformed from a place where a child was dying mysteriously into a place where medical science could finally function the way it was supposed to. Walker found him in the corridor outside. "We're going to need your full statement. Everything you observed, how you collected the evidence, the analysis you ran. Defense attorneys will try to shred it, but with the video of Thompson injecting her and the independent lab results, your kitchen chemistry becomes supporting evidence instead of the foundation." Robert nodded, too tired suddenly to process the implications. He'd been awake since 6:42, running on adrenaline and coffee, and the crash was arriving with the force of inevitability. "There's one more thing. The hospital administration wants to speak with you about your employment status." "Right. The part where violating patient privacy and conducting unauthorized investigations gets you fired even when you're correct." Walker's expression suggested he'd anticipated this. "Mrs. Anderson is handling that conversation personally. I'd wait to panic until after you hear what she has to say." The hospital administrator's office occupied the top floor, windows overlooking the city, furniture that whispered about budgets Robert couldn't fathom. Margaret was already there when he arrived, along with the hospital's chief of staff and a lawyer who'd been introduced but whose name Robert immediately forgot. The administrator, a woman named Patricia Chen, looked at Robert with an expression that combined discomfort and calculation. "Mr. Williams, your actions over the past week have put this hospital in a difficult position. Patient privacy violations, unauthorized evidence collection, interference with physician protocols. Under normal circumstances, termination would be immediate." Margaret interrupted before Robert could respond. "Under normal circumstances, your hospital wouldn't have employed a physician committing serial attempted murder for financial gain. I'd suggest we're well outside normal circumstances." Patricia Chen's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. "Mrs. Anderson has made a compelling case that your actions, while unorthodox, prevented a tragedy that would have destroyed this hospital's reputation along with my daughter's life. She's also made it clear that any punitive action against you would result in legal and financial consequences that would make the Thompson situation look manageable." Robert looked at Margaret, who met his gaze with the faintest suggestion of a smile. "So, instead, we're offering you a different position. Hospital safety consultant. Focus on identifying systematic failures that allowed this situation to occur. 40 hours a week, benefits, salary commensurate with your actual qualifications rather than your current position." The words took time to arrange themselves into meaning. Robert's brain kept stumbling over the transition from expecting termination to hearing about a position that sounded almost like what he'd lost 11 years ago. "I'm 67. Most hospitals consider that retirement age." Margaret's smile became slightly more visible. "Most hospitals are staffed by idiots. I need someone who understands pharmaceutical mechanisms well enough to catch what 20 specialists missed. Someone who won't be intimidated by credentials or hierarchy. Age is the least relevant qualification you possess." The meeting continued for another 30 minutes. Details about benefits packages and start dates and organizational reporting structures. Robert's attention drifted, kept returning to the image of Jessica Anderson finally receiving treatment that might actually help instead of systematically killing her. When it finished, he found himself in the corridor with Margaret, the others dispersing to handle the cascading consequences of Thompson's arrest. "Why are you doing this? You don't owe me anything." Margaret studied him with the assessment of someone used to evaluating complex situations quickly. "You risked everything you had left to save a child you'd never spoken to. That's either pathological stupidity or actual integrity. I'm betting on integrity, and I need people like that in my organization. Your organization is a pharmaceutical company. I work at a hospital. For now. But Anderson Biotech needs a director of safety and toxicology. Someone who knows how to identify problems before they become disasters. Someone who proved they'll fight for what's right regardless of personal cost. The position pays substantially more than hospital consulting. Starts whenever you're ready." Robert leaned against the wall, the exhaustion from the morning catching up. "What if I'm never ready? What if this was the one time I got it right and next time I'm just a 67-year-old man who can't keep up with people half my age?" "Then you'll figure it out the same way you figured out Thompson was poisoning Jessica. By being smarter and more persistent than everyone who underestimated you." She left him in the corridor, heels clicking away toward whatever crisis required her attention next. Robert stood there trying to process the idea that doing the right thing might, for the first time in a decade, result in something besides destruction. His phone showed 2:47. Emily would be home from school in 40 minutes. He needed to be there, needed to tell her something that made sense about why her grandfather looked like he'd been through a battle. The drive home took longer than usual, traffic snarled by construction on the interstate. He used the time to rehearse explanations, discarding each one as either too complicated or too simple. How did you tell a 12-year-old that the world sometimes rewarded principle instead of punishing it, when most of her life had been evidence to the contrary? Emily was already inside when he arrived, backpack on the couch, homework spread across the kitchen table. She looked up when he entered, taking in his appearance with the quick assessment kids developed when their guardians worked too much. "You look terrible." "Long day. Good kind of terrible, though." She waited for elaboration. Robert sat down across from her, pushing aside algebra worksheets to make space. Remember how I told you I used to be a scientist? Yeah. Before the thing with your old company. Right. Well, today I got to be a scientist again. Just for a little while. And it worked out better than I expected. He told her a version edited for her age, about noticing something wrong at the hospital, about figuring out what the doctors missed, about helping save someone. He left out the parts about murder and financial fraud and federal arrests. Those details could wait for when she was older. So you're still a janitor? Actually, I got a different job offer. Consultant position at the hospital. Better pay, normal hours. I'd be home for dinner every night. Emily's face did something complicated, cycling through surprise and happiness, and then landing on suspicion. Is this real? Or is this the kind of thing where it sounds good but then falls apart? The question hurt, because it was fair. She'd watched enough things fall apart to know hope required evidence. It's real. Starting next week, and there's another position, at a pharmaceutical company if I want it. Better money, chance to do actual research again. What do you want? Robert looked at his granddaughter, her homework, the apartment that barely contained them, and realized he didn't have an immediate answer. Wanting things felt dangerous after years of learning to manage expectations. I want you to have a winter coat that fits. I want to stop choosing between medicine and groceries. I want to prove that the last 9 years weren't just punishment for doing the right thing at the wrong time. Then take the job. Both of them, if you can. Emily returned to her algebra with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who'd just solved a problem. Robert sat watching her work, feeling something unlock in his chest that had been clenched tight since Elizabeth died. The following weeks moved with a speed that felt disorienting after 9 years of monotonous routine. Thompson's arrest made local news, then national news, once the financial angle became clear. Attempted murder of a child to profit from shorting the victim's mother's company created headlines that journalists couldn't resist. The FBI investigation expanded to include Meridian Capital Partners, whose short positions on Anderson Biotech suddenly looked less like shrewd investing and more like securities fraud. Thompson's lawyer issued statements about baseless charges and procedural violations, but the video of him injecting poison into an 8-year-old's IV made defense arguments feel academic. Jessica improved exactly as Robert had predicted. 48 hours after the poisoning stopped, her neurological indicators began stabilizing. Within a week, she was sitting up, complaining about hospital food, showing the resilience of children whose bodies remembered how to heal when given the chance. Robert visited her 3 weeks after Thompson's arrest, his first time entering room 14 in something other than a gray uniform. Margaret was there, looking less exhausted than the last time he'd seen her, though the experience had left marks that wouldn't fade quickly. Jessica was drawing, colored pencils spread across the bedside table, creating something that looked like a garden with flowers and colors that didn't exist in nature. "Are you the janitor?" The question came without preamble, the directness of children who hadn't learned that some questions were supposed to be approached carefully. "I was. Now I'm something else." Jessica considered this, adding purple to a flower that was already predominantly orange. "My mom said you figured out what was wrong with me, that the doctors couldn't see it, but you did. I just paid attention. Sometimes that's all it takes." She returned to her drawing, apparently satisfied. Margaret walked Robert to the door, her expression suggesting there was more to say, but she wasn't quite sure how. "The new medical team says full recovery is expected. No permanent organ damage. She'll need monitoring, but within 6 months she should be back to completely normal. That's good. Better than we had any right to hope for." Margaret hesitated, then pressed forward. "The offer still stands. Director of Safety and Toxicology at Anderson Biotech. I need someone who understands that pharmaceutical science is about saving lives, not maximizing profit. Someone who proved they'll fight for that principle even when it costs everything." Robert thought about the hospital consulting position he'd already accepted, the normal hours and the benefits package, and the chance to rebuild something resembling stability. Thought about Emily needing a grandfather who came home for dinner instead of disappearing into research that consumed everything. "Can I have time to think about it?" Take whatever time you need. The position will be there when you're ready. He started at the hospital the following Monday, an office that was smaller than what he'd had at Brennan but had a window and his name on the door. The work involved reviewing safety protocols, identifying systematic failures, basically translating his ability to see patterns into institutional change. His colleagues were younger, curious about the janitor who'd caught a murderer through kitchen chemistry, respectful in ways that suggested his story had become legend through multiple retellings. He didn't encourage the attention, but didn't shut it down either. Sometimes being visible meant accepting that people would see you. Emily thrived with the schedule change. Robert picked her up from school most days, helped with homework at reasonable hours, instead of exhausted morning rushes, could afford the field trip and the new winter coat and the small luxuries that made poverty slightly less grinding. 3 months after Thompson's arrest, the Anderson Biotech offer came up again. Margaret called his office directly, not going through secretaries or administrative channels. "I need an answer. The position has been open for 4 months. I've interviewed 6 candidates. All of them had better credentials than you on paper. None of them had what actually matters." Robert leaned back in his office chair, the one that didn't quite fit right but was better than standing all night. What actually matters? Understanding that expertise without integrity is just sophisticated ways to do harm. You proved you have both. That's rarer than credentials. He thought about it through the weekend, Emily watching him think without interrupting. Sunday evening she finally broke the silence. "You want the job." "The pharma one." "Maybe. It's more money. Chance to do real research again. So take it. It's also more risk. Research positions don't last forever. If something goes wrong, we're back where we started." Emily looked at him with an expression that was pure Elizabeth, the same mix of exasperation and affection his wife had deployed whenever he overthought decisions. "Grandpa, you spent 9 years mopping floors because you tried to stop bad people from hurting patients. Then you did it again, and this time it worked. Maybe that means you're supposed to be doing this kind of thing instead of hiding from it." The wisdom of 12-year-olds, delivered with the certainty of people who hadn't learned to fear consequences yet. Robert called Margaret Monday morning. "I'll take the position, but I need to finish the current safety review at the hospital first. Can't leave them in the middle of a project." "Finish the review. We'll handle the transition." "Welcome to Anderson Biotech, Dr. Williams." The title landed different this time, not as something lost, but as something reclaimed through harder roads than he'd expected to travel. 6 months after Thompson's arrest, Robert started at Anderson Biotech. The building was smaller than Brennan's tower, the office less impressive, but the work mattered in ways that felt clean. Identifying potential toxicity issues before they reached human trials, reviewing adverse event reporting to catch the kind of data manipulation that had destroyed his previous career. His team was small, 3 researchers who looked barely old enough to have graduate degrees, but worked with the intensity of people who believed science done right could change the world. He let them believe it. Maybe they'd prove him wrong about how often the system crushed that idealism. Emily adjusted to the change with resilience that reminded him she'd already survived worse disruptions. New apartment, bigger than the old one, her own room with actual space for homework and the art projects she'd started creating, walking distance to a better school district, heat that worked consistently. The gray uniform stayed in his closet, not as nostalgia, but as evidence. 9 years of being invisible had taught him to observe without being observed, to see patterns others missed because they weren't trained to look at the places nobody watched. That education had cost him everything once and nearly cost him everything again. But in the end, it had been exactly what an 8-year-old girl needed to survive, and exactly what a 67-year-old man needed to prove that principle sometimes won, even when the odds suggested otherwise. Thompson's trial was set for the following spring. Federal prosecutors building a case that included attempted murder, securities fraud, and violations of medical ethics so comprehensive they'd probably create new categories. His lawyers were good, but the video of him injecting poison into a child's IV was hard to explain away. Robert would testify. The chemistry, the timeline, the observations that 20 specialists missed. His kitchen table laboratory work wouldn't be admissible, but it had led to legitimate evidence that was. Sometimes being right the wrong way created paths to being right the right way. 1 year after Thompson's arrest, Robert attended Jessica Anderson's 9th birthday party. Margaret had invited him, along with Agent Walker and Linda Martinez, who'd quietly documented Thompson's solo assessment times after Robert's suggestion and whose notes had supported the timeline. Jessica was completely recovered, running around with friends, no visible evidence of the 7 weeks she'd spent dying. She paused long enough to thank Robert for saving her life, the words delivered with the casual sincerity of children who hadn't yet learned that gratitude required performative weight. "You're welcome, sweetheart." She ran off to rejoin her friends, already moving past the trauma that would probably surface later in therapy, but for now was just a story about the time she was really sick. Margaret approached with 2 glasses of wine, handed him one. 2 unlikely heroes. He accepted the glass but didn't drink immediately. "I'm not a hero, just someone who was in the right place with the right training and couldn't look away. That's what heroes are, people who can't look away when everyone else does." The party continued around them, children shrieking with joy, parents chatting about school districts and summer camps, and the normal concerns of people whose lives weren't defined by crisis. Robert stood watching it all, holding wine he barely touched, thinking about Elizabeth and what she'd say about how this turned out. She'd probably point out that vindication came too late to save their marriage or their son. That being right didn't undo the years of poverty and struggle, and watching Emily grow up in apartments where the heat didn't work. She wouldn't be wrong. But she'd also, eventually, admit that saving one child's life mattered, even if it didn't fix everything else that was broken. Elizabeth had been angry at the end, but underneath that anger had been the same core belief that Robert carried. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the cost was catastrophic. Emily found him near the end of the party, accepted the piece of cake he'd saved for her despite the abundance available. "This is pretty nice." "Yeah, it is. Are you going to keep doing this kind of thing? Finding bad stuff and stopping it?" Robert considered the question. His role at Anderson Biotech focused on systematic safety rather than dramatic interventions, but the underlying principle was the same. "I'm going to keep paying attention, keep looking for patterns others miss. That's what I'm trained to do." "Cool. Just maybe don't wait 9 years between the times you actually do something about what you find." She ate her cake, wisdom delivered, and attention already moving elsewhere. Robert watched her, watched Jessica playing with friends, watched Margaret talking with the new medical team who'd helped complete her daughter's recovery. Being invisible for 9 years had taught him observation. Being visible again was teaching him that observation combined with action could actually matter, that sometimes the system worked if you pushed hard enough with enough evidence. Thompson had tried to murder a child for $11 million and gotten caught because the janitor mopping the floor turned out to be exactly the wrong person to underestimate. There was something beautifully simple about that, the way expertise didn't disappear just because circumstance forced you into positions where nobody expected you to have any. The party wound down. Robert drove home with Emily, who fell asleep in the passenger seat despite the early hour. He carried her inside, got her to bed, then stood in his apartment that was bigger than the last one but still small enough that every sound traveled. His phone showed an email from Walker. Thompson's lawyer had reached out about a plea deal, apparently recognizing that taking the video evidence to trial was career suicide. The details would take months to finalize, but it looked like Thompson would spend the next 20 years in federal prison, followed by permanent medical license revocation. Justice, Robert supposed, though it felt incomplete. Jessica had survived, but Thompson had already spent 7 weeks slowly murdering her. Time didn't reverse. Trauma didn't erase. The best outcome was still built on the foundation of harm that couldn't be undone. But incomplete justice was better than no justice. A child alive was better than a child dead. A career rebuilt at 67 was better than dying invisible and forgotten. Robert stood at his window looking out at a city that had never cared much about his existence, that had let him mop floors for 9 years without noticing the expertise behind the uniform. He'd proven that invisibility had advantages, that being underestimated created opportunities to see what everyone else missed. Now he had the chance to use that lesson differently, to build institutions that didn't make the mistake of assuming credentials mattered more than competence, position more than principle. Emily would watch him do it, learning that sometimes the right thing cost everything, and sometimes it gave you back more than you'd lost. Both lessons mattered. She'd need both to navigate the world that waited for her. The gray uniform still hung in his closet. He kept it there as evidence that 9 years of being invisible had taught him exactly how to be seen when it mattered most. Some education came through suffering. The trick was making sure the suffering taught you something worth knowing. Robert Williams had learned. Now he had the rest of his life to prove it.